morning and welcome to the webinar. We'll get started in just a couple of minutes as people are populating the event. Good morning and welcome to green and equitable recovery. And I'm hoping that that is what in fact we're having and not just the webinar that we're having today. We'll get started in just a couple minutes. Great. Welcome to the webinar on a green and equitable recovery. My name is Dan Lashoff. I am the U.S. Director for the World Resources Institute, and on behalf of WRI and World War Zero, we're really glad that you joined us today for this event. WRI is a global research organization working at the nexus of environment, economics and economic opportunity and human well-being. We like to describe ourselves as a think and do tank. World War Zero is a broad coalition of activists and influencers on a mission to make climate change a top priority and reach net zero emissions by 2050. It was founded just a couple of years ago by John Kerry and Arnold Schwarzenegger and John Kasich. John Kerry, of course, now the first special presidential envoy on climate change. And one of the first inductees was Gina McCarthy, now the domestic climate advisor, as well as Carol Browner, who previously served in a similar role and will be joining us on the panel. So really excited to have them and to have World War Zero as a co-sponsor of this event. We also want to thank the Rockefeller Foundation, whose support has made this possible. So as Congress is debating a third economic relief package that looks to help the economy reopen safely with vaccine distribution and direct economic rescue support, at the same time, the Biden administration is preparing a bold proposal for a Build Back Better recovery plan that will mean major investments in infrastructure, buildings, clean energy, and that will be a key to reducing pollution, building resilience, and growing the economy in a way that puts the US on track to meet its climate goals. At WRI, we believe that our recovery needs to be green, but it also needs to be equitable and seek to address the historic and persistent inequalities in the economy that existed before COVID-19, but were certainly underscored by the effects of the pandemic and the disproportionate impacts on disadvantaged communities. It also means measures that increase high quality, sustainable employment opportunities for communities that are underserved, under-resourced, or impacted by the energy transition, which is why President Biden has committed to allocate at least 40% of the funding to ensure that 40% of the clean energy investments to disadvantaged communities. And I'm looking forward to hearing from this really great panel on what that Justice 40 commitment could look like in practice. At the same time, we also know, as underscored by the recent disaster in Texas and previous catastrophes in California and elsewhere, Puerto Rico, elsewhere around the country, that as we build infrastructure, we need to build more resilient infrastructure to the effects of climate change, with particular focus on improving outcomes for Black and Brown and Indigenous communities that were once again hit the hardest by the impacts of recent disasters. So without further ado, that brings us to today's conversation. We're looking really forward to it. Just a housekeeping note. I think by now everybody's lived on Zoom for a year, but just a reminder for this webinar format, please use the Q&A box to ask your questions. You can enter those questions at any time during the event. We'll get to them as much as possible. We will be recording the webinar and it will be available on the WRI event page within a day or so. So with that, I'm excited and happy to get out of the way and turn this over to Neela Banerjee, who is the climate editor at NPR. Neela, thank you very much.
Thanks, Dan. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. As Dan said, the profound damage from extreme weather that Texas and other states endured last week are the latest events to underscore the urgent need to remedy environmental injustices. I don't know how many of you have seen the on-the-ground reporting that's shown that power and water outages, food shortages have hit low-income communities and Black and Brown communities the hardest. Shutdowns of refineries and other petrochemical sites released an estimated 3.5 million pounds of air pollution, according to Texas environmental groups, and that hits Black and Brown fence line communities disproportionately. So at this time, with this latest reminder, it makes sense for the federal government to step in more fully. Decades, if not centuries, of federal policies rooted in racism have created the injustices that communities face. The notion of environmental justice has been around for decades, and yet the people who are harmed the most by pollution have seen few improvements, and many are skeptical that those improvements will come now. So my questions as we approach this are, what needs to happen to change that skepticism? I imagine a lot of you share those questions. And what does progress look like? So our panel is uniquely qualified to address those questions from different critical vantage points. Joining us today are Carol Browner, Raya Salter, and Brad Markell. So Ms. Browner is the board chair at the League of Conservation Voters and former administrator at the EPA. She also served as assistant to President Obama and director of the White House Office of Energy and Climate Change Policy. During her tenure, the White House established new fuel efficiency standards for vehicles after years of inaction. Raya Salter is a member of the New York State Climate Action Council, and she's a policy organizer at NY News. Ms. Salter is an attorney, educator, and policy expert with a focus on energy and climate justice. As a member of that New York State Climate Action Council, they're the ones who developed New York's ambitious climate goals, and it's those goals that served as a blueprint for the Justice 40 plan that you're seeing now coming out of the Biden administration. Brad Markell is the executive director of the AFL-CIO's Industrial Union Council and the Working for America Institute. He leads the climate and energy policy work at the AFL-CIO, which means he's coordinating AFL-CIO affiliates to advance interests of workers in energy producing and energy intensive sectors. He's led US labor delegations to several UN climate negotiations. So as we get started, I'd like to the first question to Raya, and what I wanted to ask is, from your perspective, what does a green and equitable recovery look like?
Well, thank you so much, Neela. I want to say thank you, WRI. Thank you, World War Zero, for this forum and this opportunity to discuss this important topic. So Yes, the key to an equitable recovery and equitable development in general is ensuring that equity is at the center of policy in accountable ways. We've got to start with basic needs and then move into this major infrastructure development. And in the New York law, this means that environmental justice must be considered by the state as decisions are made. And I do think that we need federal frameworks that enforce this for all sectors. So we need to look at the recovery as an arc that starts with meeting those urgent basic needs and moves towards that multi-sectoral development that we need to achieve our energy and environmental goals. So that needs to start with affordable access to reliable and safe utility service and housing. We've got to address affordable access. We're in a crisis right now with an uneven patchwork of state utility shutoff and eviction moratoria. No state has the funds in place to meet energy affordability needs, and this was true before the pandemic. So we need comprehensive and cohesive policies to fix this patchwork for the long term with federal support. Which can then provide that foundation for, in this example, greening the housing sector, which we need to do if we're going to meet our emissions goals. So again, in another example, say in New York, as we move forward with our clean energy standard, we're planning new transmission. Is disproportionate harm being caused to EJ communities? How are we ensuring that the prioritization of emissions and co-pollutant reductions is happening in EJ communities? So this examination has to happen across the board, and there needs to be that process for identifying and tracking and accountability. Oh, and the last thing I'll say is this 40% Justice Now frame must start now. And in New York, that means 40% of all investments, job programs, workforce development, pollution reduction, energy assistance. So we can start this 40% redirect frame now.
That's great, thank you. So did I unmute myself? Yeah. So I wanted to, that's a really good framework for I think the next question, which is about bringing this to fruition. And Carol, given all of the different roles that you've played in government, I wanted to ask you how, what are the tools and processes that the Biden administration might have at its disposal to advance these goals?
Thank you, Neela. And let me just start by also thanking WRI and Dan and all the folks at WRI who made today possible. And what a pleasure it is, Neela, to be with you again, and Raya and Brad. And what a absolutely important conversation. In preparing for today, I knew that President Clinton had actually signed an executive order on environmental justice, but I wanted to remember the date. So I looked it up, and it actually dates back to 1994. So early in his administration, we did recognize, I chaired a government-wide effort, and we, I think, brought the issue sort of attention to the issue, but I'll be honest with you, we didn't come anywhere near close to doing enough. And so it's very exciting that we have in President Biden an absolute commitment on the issues of environmental justice, on the disproportionate impacts that occur from pollution, lack of jobs, illness in communities of color, low-income communities. And I think it's important to note that Biden really did run on this as part of his sort of principles. He embraced the need to address environmental justice. And I sort of use the phrase very, very broadly. The question, Neela, you asked me is, what are the tools that he has available? Obviously, he can sign an executive order. He's been signing a lot of executive orders, and those are important because they focus the attention of the agencies. But he can go much further. And I would say that the sort of primary tools are, one, science. We can show that these communities are disproportionately impacted. We can show how air pollution, for example, is worse in these communities than in other communities. Despite all the progress we've made, there still is this effect in low income and predominantly communities of color. He can set regulations that take into account this disparate impact. He can require that we reduce pollution. So whether it's strengthening conventional air pollutant requirements, water pollution requirements, new climate change requirements. Essential will be transparency. And so opening the government up and allowing folks to really understand what the government is doing, how the government is doing something, and engaging communities in these conversations. Clearly enforcing any regulation. It's one thing to put a regulation on the book, but if you don't enforce it, it ends up not having a lot of meaning. And so enhancing the enforcement activities. And finally, and Raya and others, Raya spoke to this, the issue of investment, the Build Back Better plan that the president has put forward during the campaign and will form sort of the infrastructure legislation that he will seek post-COVID. Legislation is hugely important, and how that money is allocated, how the jobs are created, the industries that the jobs are created in, all of that is going to be important. He has said he wants to build a clean energy economy, and doing that in a way that is fair, just, and equitable will be absolutely essential. So I guess I would just close by saying, I think it's exciting times. I think there are a lot of opportunities. We all need to grab those and really drive them forward so they become, the standard protocol as opposed to the exception that occasionally is embraced, but rather the way we think about doing all of this work when it comes to addressing climate pollution and comes to addressing conventional pollution.
Great, thank you. And so I wanted to ask you, Brad, about the fact that, a lot of this is tied into to job creation, but also as a clean energy transition occurs, there will be people who might lose their livelihoods. And so, as the Biden administration moves forward with its plans, what can be done to protect workers and improve their circumstances? And where there are concerns that there might be communities of workers who get left behind?
Well, thanks, Neela, and thanks to WRI for inviting labor into this conversation. Really happy to be here. I think I want to pick up on something Carol said about investment, right? A lot of this just revolves around investment. Where are we steering investment to? We know places that have been disinvested. I'm talking to you from the Detroit area today. It's been very disinvested, Flint, Gary, whatever, places like that. And communities that just don't have enough jobs. It goes for fossil communities too, right? So there are places in Appalachia. We'll see what happens in Wyoming as federal leasing starts to New Mexico, places where investment needs to be driven to deal with the transition. For labor, yes, people are losing their jobs. A lot of that happens through new technologies coming into the marketplace. And the question is, are we replacing quality jobs with quality jobs? So far, we're not, right? We have a lot of very highly unionized jobs in the fossil sector that pay extremely well. And we have a lot of mostly non-union jobs in the green sector that don't pay so well. This is sort of on the back end of 40 years of stagnant incomes and income inequality. And it's a big change. And people are sort of fearful about how it's going to land for them. The Justice 40 commitment is really important to the labor movement because these are places where a lot of union members live and a lot of places that need to be cleaned up and suffer from pollution, the diesel fumes and things like that are in neighborhoods. Labor movement identified 25 years ago how bad PM 2.5 was. We were in a big push to get it out of our factories, right? And so it's no better in your neighborhood than it is in one of our factories. And I think the last thing I'll say is a defining feature of the clean energy economy is that spending that used to be on fuels becomes spending on a manufactured item. So if we don't capture the clean energy manufacturing here up where Raya is right now, we're all waiting with bated breath to see what's going to go up in Albany. Is there really going to be a turbine factory there? Or are we just talking about imported parts? We got to get that clean energy manufacturing. That's a big part of the deal.
That's great, thank you. So, one of the things that's come up, and I want to address this to Raya, but Carol and Brad, feel free to jump in too. But it's about in discussions of justice, very often the exact communities that have been so badly affected for years are not participating in the discussion, at least not in a full-fledged way. And so I wanted to ask what does participation look like? Like, what new processes would the Biden administration need to set up, or standing processes that need to be fleshed out and strengthened to ensure participation by the very people who've been affected by sort of pollution injustice, or what you're talking about, Brad, and in communities, extraction communities, like in Appalachia or the Gulf Coast. Can we talk a little bit about how to get these voices and to get their opinions really weighed properly?
This is a great question, and it's actually one of my favorite questions by my lights. It's often overlooked, and it couldn't be more important. We often see community engagement as a PowerPoint and cookies event at a community center. And don't get me wrong, I have personally done many of those, and I'm not knocking them, and I anticipate doing more of them. But we need deeper consultation, awareness, and engagement, notice and consent. These are bedrocks of policy, of equitable policy development that actually impacts people. And I really encourage folks to think broadly about this, because the truth is that we will not reach our goals without mass adoption, without culture change, without the ability for these initiatives to impact people's everyday lives in empowering ways. And this goes way beyond cookies and PowerPoints. And it also goes way beyond traditional things that I still advocate for, like consultation tables with EJ groups and others, funding for things like intervenor compensation, so groups can actually participate in EPA processes and others. So by my lights, we need significant investment in environmental education, engagement, and training on all fronts, in school and at work. I'm a fan of the idea of a robust climate core agenda where young people and people of all ages get living wages to find solutions. Communities need to be empowered to develop their own knowledge base and deploy their own experts so that these solutions can be fine-tuned. And one thing that is really important that I've noticed as we try and do implementation on policies is that often there's an expectation that a community member, a community center, a community association head is going to do all the deep work to sort of like put in a community solar project. We need to fund the supportive fabric and human beings and money and time to make these projects actually happen.
If I might just add to Maria's points. When I got to EPA, and I know this is a while ago, we had a Superfund program. It was not really cleaning up a lot of sites. And the protocol was EPA developed a cleanup plan, sued the polluter, and then went to the community and said, here's what we're going to do. And it just ended up in back and forth and nothing ever happening. And it occurred to us that maybe we should go to the community first and say, yes, you have this polluted site. It needs to be cleaned up. We totally agree. What would you like to have happen with that site? Yes, it's going to get cleaned up, but let's think about not just cleaning up. Let's think about what comes after, because that's really where you get the value of it, whether it becomes a playground or it becomes a new industry, whatever. And we were able to, by just flipping the question around and engaging the community on the front end, we cleaned up over 600 sites in 8 years, whereas 130 sites in the first 12 years of the program. I may have my numbers slightly wrong, but the magnitude was significant. And so I learned a really valuable lesson about going to the community and engaging them early. The second thing we did, Raya, to your point, is we started making grants. They needed to be able to hire their own experts, to be able to hire their own scientists to help them understand, so they could be an informed participant in the conversation. And so I think that helping to your point, Raya, on environmental education, that giving people some know-how. And many communities have learned that over the years, and they're awesome at it. But for those that haven't, bringing them to the table as an equal voice means giving them access to information and a knowledge base that will make them that equal voice.
I wanted to tweak that and ask you, Brad, something slightly different. I wanted to ask, I get the sense from workers in fossil fuel industries that they feel really scared and threatened by these changes. I think a lot of them do know climate change is occurring, but they're, you know, like you said, you know, a lot of these jobs are union jobs, whether in coal country or in the oil patch or along the Gulf Coast. And it's very often a choice between a job that'll make you six figures, give you a middle-class life, that you put your kids through college, and a service job that barely pays above minimum wage. And so sometimes I wonder, and I grew up in Southeast Louisiana in St. Charles Parish, which is kind of the tail end of, yes, of Cancer Alley. And my folks are still down there. And so what I wanted to ask is how, you know, what does it take to build trust with people who are an important constituency, whose buy-in you need, whose own health is affected by, you know, the extraction industries and the pollution in, you know, where they live. What have you seen that's effective in getting discussions with them, getting their input, getting them to trust that they're not going to be left high and dry by this process? So, you know, and whether you've known examples that have worked of starting communication with fossil fuel workers, petrochemical workers, them feeling like they actually have adequate input, and then there's some kind of just outcome. I mean, has that even occurred yet? Or what, if it hasn't, what would that look like in your mind?
Well, so I've been involved in the just transition movement for probably 10 or 15 years now, both internationally. There's a process inside the COP for that, but also just here domestically. And going back to what Raya was saying, there's no concept of justice in this scenario that does not include the input and the consent of the people who are at the heart of this, right? And so we really have to make sure that we're understanding where they're coming from. You know, that Fox News and the right-wing media has been running quite a bit with the Keystone announcement and trying to turn that into a wedge. And so we're getting in our internal press monitoring all these clips. There's a guy this morning who Fox News had on saying, you know, about the U.S.-Canada agreement, and they try to pin him down. This oil worker's been laid off, a guy laid off from the Keystone project. But Fox didn't quite get it right, because the guy was like, I agree with going green. I just need to know where my job is. And he's been laid off from Keystone, right? So a lot of it, we really don't have examples. And that is part of the way that, at least from my point of view, the working class has been pushed down a little bit. And, you know, in the Biden administration and the campaign, EJ and labor have been sort of elevated in ways very directly that were not really that overt before, casting aspersions anywhere. But, you know, President Biden is a very strong union supporter. They have made it clear that EJ is going to be in the middle of all the ways they're making decisions. And these are things, both the labor movement and EJ movement are working class movements concerned with the outcomes for working class people. And I think as long as we keep centered on that discussion, we can do a lot of good things.
I'm muted because there's something banging outside my door. I don't know what it is, but anyways, pardon me. So there's one thing I wanted to find out is, you know, obviously there's steps that need to be taken to reduce emissions. There's steps that need to be taken and to bring benefits to communities whose identities often overlap, right? Like in Cancer Alley, some of the people who are affected by the health outcomes there also work in the petrochemical plants and so on. I wanted to ask about equity in climate adaptation. NPR has looked a lot at who gets help after disaster, how long that help lasts, how equitable it is. And so I was wondering whether you're seeing any kind of signs of what the Biden administration might do to create a more equitable response to adaptation, and what that would look like. And is that part of Justice 40, or is that something kind of separate?
I would say it's absolutely a part of Justice 40. You'll hear me talk a lot about couching that from the New York experience, but a big piece of what the New York landmark climate law, the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act did was say, no longer will we look at a traditional RPS that focuses only on energy in the energy sector. We need to focus on justice and climate adaptation and resilience. And what does investment in that frame look like? And so as New York is developing the definition of what that 40, who will be the beneficiary of that 40%, we have initial criteria that's baked into our law that talks about those who are vulnerable to climate impacts, those who have negative health impacts, those who have negative environmental justice impacts, and importantly, who has historically experienced discrimination on the basis of race and ethnicity. So the idea of climate resilience and clean energy development going hand in hand, and the clean energy economy more broadly is critical. And that is how we will get to the sort of win-win of climate investment going forward from this just recovery frame. It won't happen if we focus only on clean energy, one sector of the economy. It won't happen if we're only focused on resilience. It won't happen unless we're focused on both for those who are the most vulnerable and need it most. That's going to be a frame, and I hope the federal folks take that in mind as well.
Carol, Brad, do you guys have any thoughts about adaptation and justice and how that would work together?
Please, Carol.
I try and think about adaptation and resiliency as opposite sides of the same coin. Adaptation is a recognition that more and more storms are going to come, that more and more communities are going to be impacted. How do we adapt to that? Resiliency is what can we do to get back up operating quickly? What do we have to, and so they have to work together. Again, I think it's one of these situations where we need to engage communities that are going to be impacted. We need to understand what they think an adaptation and resiliency plan should be. How does it really, end up working for them? I will tell you, I think that there's a lot of opportunity in the federal government to really strengthen the adaptation and resiliency commitments. There's a lot of money. EPA moves something on the order of $2.5 billion a year to states in the drinking water and the wastewater, the sewer revolving funds. Allowing states to start to use some of that money, not just for bricks and mortar, which they have historically done, and that's important, but to also use it for floodplains and other sorts of more natural systems that can help take a storm surge, for example. Similarly, the Department of Transportation, they move a boatload of money, out. And when they think about how they invest in our transportation sector, and I know, Brad, a lot of those jobs are union jobs, and there's an opportunity to bring the unions into this discussion about adaptation and resiliency. For those of you who live in DC and have been able to go outside, they're redoing the sidewalks in DC to account for the flooding that is taking place, right? So a lot of jobs out there breaking up the sidewalks and putting in these sort of little retention areas that will allow the storm water to more naturally move through vegetation before it hits the sewer system, before it hits the Anacostia and the Potomac. And so I think, we need to go back and look at all the ways in which the federal government moves money. Forget about the new infrastructure package. That will be important, but there's existing pots of money, very large pots of money. With a little bit of retooling, they could become an important piece of how communities think about adaptation and resiliency.
Just say that adaptation and resilience are under discussed and underfunded, and we need to move a lot more in that direction. And if we start discussing it, I think we'll find out that the very communities we're talking about are the ones that need the most investment, right? There are a lot of EJ issues. All of a sudden, the land that is 5, 6, 7 miles back from the waterfront in Miami used to be low priced. Now it's, let's make sure that people that have been here for decades don't get pushed out of those neighborhoods. But there's the political footprint of potential adaptation and resistance. Resistance work too, but resilience work is fantastic. I think about the Missouri River, for example. I think about rebuilding, the coastline in Louisiana. There's a Republican congressman down there who would love to do that. I think we should help him.
So, we're going to start getting to audience questions soon. And some of the questions we are asking are from the questions that many of you submitted when you registered. But what this has me thinking about is, there's executive orders, there's incentives, there's money. And Carol, you mentioned a very important thing, and that is enforcement, right? That, you know, the reporting that that we've done as journalists show that communities, a lot of EJ communities feel like, you know, that we are being polluted. You know that we cannot leave our homes without our eyes burning and our throats hurting. And yet, you know, there are no penalties, or the penalties are so slight for the polluters that it's not a disincentive. So a couple of questions. One is, well, I guess the central question, let me just leave it with that, is, are executive orders enough, or do we need laws? And so that there's something, there's a law that you can use to sue polluters, that communities can use to sue polluters. And what are the chances of that? I mean, basically, are executive orders and just the will to change enough, or do we need to, does the government or do communities need sticks as well as carrots to bring down the pollution that affects them?
So certainly, you know, I think, you know, executive orders are not enough. And I really do hope that at this really critical moment in time, that we use all the power that we have to push for legislation, to push for the changes that we need to see in law. And however, the stepping up enforcement, funding enforcement, taking enforcement very seriously, which there's a lot of repair that needs to happen from the previous administration, is of course a very critical step. In the interim, some things say, you know, the way New York's climate law works, we are really working to, you know, how the other piece, executive orders, how the administration will structure itself. So we're encouraging the administration to take this interagency approach on climate for all the arms of government, to be looking for savings, looking for these programs like Carol mentioned. That will also be really important. But we need laws. We need laws and enforcement.
A couple of thoughts. I agree, we need laws. I hope we have a Congress that will deliver laws. I don't count on that. There are laws on the books. The Clean Air Act of 1990, we have litigated it all the way to the Supreme Court, and it says EPA shall regulate greenhouse gases if it finds those gases endanger public health and welfare. So, you know, one of the things we did with Obama, and I think one of the things that Biden will do, is move out on both fronts, right? Don't just put all your eggs in one basket and try and get Congress to give you some sort of change in the law or some new law. You know, also use your regulatory authority. And remember, all those regulatory authorities that sit over at transportation, energy, EPA, they all flow from a law that was passed by Congress. And so, you know, those are important authorities, and they're notice and comment. There are ways to engage communities. So one is to make sure you're using the authorities, you know, on the books. What an executive order does is it tells the agency to do something, like adopt a fuel efficiency standard. It can't actually adopt the fuel efficiency standard. The agency has to go through the work. So it's a sign that the president wants something to happen. It's a very important sign, but it doesn't actually require the polluter to do something. So we need the executive orders. We need the agencies then to adopt the regulations, and then ultimately we need them to enforce them. And one of the things that the Trump so there are two things that happen when you are found in violation of a pollution law. One, you pay a penalty. That penalty is set forth in the statute. It's a per day, per ton, whatever. There are different formulations. But then frequently, you can't go get that pollution out of the air. So one of the things I did when all the major truck manufacturers were cheating, as I said, you know, I need something more. I need something that benefits communities, not just a fine that goes over to the Department of you know, to the Treasury. And so you guys, under the law, I can't regulate you the way the law is set up for another 6 years, but you can agree in court to be regulated in 3 years. So I'm going to pull forward the regulations and get 3 years of lower pollution than the law otherwise allowed. Audi, Volkswagen, when they got in trouble on the diesel, part of what they agreed to do, they paid a fine, was to invest in electrification. And they are building out a very large electrification system. And so what we need to do is make sure that the administration is not just enforcing and collecting penalties. Those are important, but it is getting something in addition through these supplemental environmental project steps for the communities that are suffering. There's, I think it might be part of the Volkswagen, it might be a part of a different settlement, buses, cleaner buses in low-income communities. I mean, there's a whole set of things, and it's another tool the government has that I hope this administration will bring to bear.
Thanks. So I wanted to switch gears a little bit and bring up a question for you, Brad, that somebody among the audience has asked. And that is that this person said that they received job retraining funds in the 80s when their job became obsolete, and asks, can't we create a similar program for workers who've lost a job in oil, manufacturing, or technology that could capture a need in the workforce, technology sectors that would capture a needed workforce that's motivated to retrain. So it is about job retraining and stuff. But I would add an addendum to that. Are there job retraining programs, especially for people coming from fossil fuels, that have worked? Because sometimes there really seems to be a mismatch between the training and the jobs available in that community. So can you address the whole issue of retraining and whether it's been successful so far?
I can, because this is a subject that drives the labor movement absolutely crazy. So if you just come to workers and communities with training, you're going to get a stiff arm. You're going to think Jim Brown ran you over. For those of us that are old enough to remember Jim Brown. And the reason is that training does not create jobs. Investment creates jobs, which then brings the need for training. So when you talk about fossil fuel workers, in a lot of cases, you're talking about the building trades unions. They run collectively a $1.7 billion a year training program. What we find is that the skills outside of some very narrow areas, like working at the top of a wind tower, requires some really particular safety training, and there are standards. But outside of those sort of areas, the training that we have now and the skills that we have now translate almost perfectly to the green economy, right? To make electric cars, any auto worker can step in with a couple of days training and start making electric vehicles. That's not a problem, right? If you're an IBW trained electrician, then you are learning how to do solar panels. Everybody in the IBW that's an electrician learns how to do solar panels. Not stuck to some solar installer job where I learn how to put up racks and I make 18 bucks an hour, but a career as an electrician. So for us, the shortage is the quality of good jobs in the green sector, not the training. Some people will need training. The most important aspect of the training is opening up quality training to disadvantaged communities and people that have been locked out of these jobs. If we're going to do all this investment, it's not just 40% of the investment. How about 40% of the jobs, and making sure that we're really understanding the pathways. I run our 501c3 for training. You have to do a lot to make sure that you're not just taking the first person that's coming down the pike, but you're actually opening up the opportunity for communities that have been locked out of these opportunities. If we don't do that, we're not going to be successful in this.
So just to follow up on that, and this is a question for everybody, because I mean, a lot of discussion about retraining says, well, take you from there and you can help install solar panels or wind turbines, but just to your point about a broader set of opportunities, I mean, things like retrofitting housing, especially public housing, infrastructure projects that maybe elevate roads and other infrastructure in flood-prone areas, which is vast parts of this country. Is there a sense that shifts could be made where you don't necessarily need a factory or a solar farm in your community to transfer these the skills that you pick up in building trades to in fact working on adaptation, weatherization, and efficiency projects in your community, and also training people, like you said, who've historically been left out, to get those skills? I mean, is that an area where people can bring the skills that they've gotten in fossil fuel industries? Have we seen it anywhere?
What I can certainly, what I can certainly speak to, which is like a slightly more overarching, but is a really critical question right now, is what are the mechanisms for, say, this Justice 40, for this investment, not only to be redirected and to happen, but to have substantive benefit, and how that will actually create economic opportunity at the community level. Full participation of environmental and climate justice communities in this clean energy economy. And that is something like we are very focused on, because this in part, I believe, means we need to increase grants and other investment vehicles for community-based groups, for indigenous groups, and really try and think about how models like our green banks and other models can be reconfigured to really create authentic investment opportunities. So there are, as you're saying, there are so many different, and of course there always needs to be that, assurance that those who will lose their jobs will be able to, to be able to redeploy, and there needs to be support for that as we go. But looking at what those mechanisms are and mean, and that's going to mean engagement and allowing investment at the community level.
I would just say EJ groups and community groups should receive more investment for capacity building. It's a really critical part of making sure that everybody's voice gets into the process. And a lot of times unions have resources, but capacity is lacking. There's a lot of moving things that union leaders are trying to deal with. So we try to provide a little bit of capacity, but it's super important that we're looking at the outcomes we want with respect to diversity and opportunity, and being intentional about it. Because if you're not super intentional about it, you're going to miss.
Yeah, I mean, right. There has to be, I was about to say, you're right everywhere. Like anytime, whether it's journalism or anything else, there has to be an intentionality about inclusion. Like it just doesn't happen on its own. So, we've been talking about the possibilities, and threaded through the possibilities is some, kind of nervousness or anxiety about how this is all going to happen. So let's just dive into that nervousness and talk about what are the barriers that you see, either financially, politically, socially, what could stand in the way of, say, the Justice 40 goals? Yeah.
A ton of things. Expedience, urgency, skipping over the need to build the community infrastructure that needs to happen, skipping over a lens that understands that we're really looking at this broad scope of energy and justice is rooted in originally how the energy systems were placed, but underinvestment in these energy systems. Our energy systems are dirty, aging, and polluting, vulnerable to attack. So I guess from there's so many ways to answer it, but my answer would be we have to be smart and intentional on the overarching frame and what it is that we're looking to do. And if we focus on financialization, of a clean energy transition, if we also focus on false solutions that that folks think that we can create a market and that's going to take care of everything, and that's going to take care of our international obligations and international trade and all these things that we need to be focusing on, we won't get there. It's a transformational process, and we have to think of it in that regard.
I totally agree. It is transformational. And I think if I could say one thing, it's the lack of intentionality. If we are not intent about this at every single turn, it will fall away. And that's hard to do. It's hard for government to do. They have their way of doing things. Communities have their way of doing things. And so it's constantly asking the question and flipping whatever you're doing around to see what the consequences are, and are they equitable, and are they just? And it will take time. It is important that we take the time. But if there's one thing I would encourage everybody, it's this intentionality to make sure it is part and parcel of every single thing we're thinking about and doing.
And I'll
So-
add, I don't want to step on Brad, but
Go ahead,
it's
please.
hard. Like, this is literally in New York, the laws frame. You have to consider, agencies must consider disproportionate burden to environmental justice communities and environmental emissions reductions with every decision. And it's a kind of framework, but not every agency. You've got the Public Service Commission, the Transportation Commission is used to doing. So there's some infrastructure that needs to be built there in terms of how the lens that folks use, be it cost benefit analysis, community engagement, or others, to make that determination.
So we have, I think, about 10 minutes left in our discussion. So I would encourage all of you to submit questions to Q&A and really to keep a focus on environmental justice. I see that there are questions about agriculture or net zero, and those are really important topics. They're just not the topics that we're discussing today. This is obviously part of it. So so if there's stuff that you want to drill deeper into on environmental justice, please use the Q&A function.
I would just say, I was trying to read the questions quickly. I wasn't able to, but on agriculture, and I don't know what the specific question is, there is a huge environmental justice issue in terms of workers.
Pack that for us, Carol. Tell us about that, and the rest of you.
Yeah, I mean, and others can probably speak to it even better than I can, but if you just think about what the workers are exposed to, both their working conditions, their living conditions frequently, and then obviously the degree to which things are happening in the field, the degree to which chemicals are being used. And this is frequently a community of people, a community of workers that are not put front and center. And so I think, whether it's EPA looking at the registration of a new chemical or a pesticide, an herbicide, a fungicide, whatever, how they think about the impacts on the worker. So for example, you might think about what's going to happen if that chemical's on food that somebody eats. You might think about it in isolation of other chemicals that you might be exposed to. For those workers, you need to think about all of the exposures. You need to think about the cumulative impact in making a decision. By putting, we had a policy when I was at EPA in those programs to put, pregnant women and children first and foremost, because we knew if we were protecting them, we were protecting everyone. I would say putting workers and the cumulative impact of chemical exposures that workers experience, hugely important.
Right, and heat, right? That's, anybody who works outdoors, from first responders to landscapers to construction workers, oil field workers, heat's going to be a big issue. So one question we had wanted a bit more detail about retraining, and here I'll just read it to you. Somebody asked, what can you all suggest in the way of more comprehensive economic revitalization and development to support transitions in fossil fuel communities? What legislation needs to occur at federal and perhaps state levels? Also, regarding workers affected by moving away from fossil fuels, they need income security and retirement supports for those workers who are close to retirement. And so, it's kind of like the whole package that's needed. You guys want to address that?
Well, so we're, first of all, the Biden administration just kicked off this huge interagency process around coal and fossil communities that we think is really important. But the bigger picture, around that is going to be back to investment. We expect, as legislation is unveiled and we start to build back better, that there will be kind of a just transition component. Labor likes the German Coal Commission model, which did sort of set aside, and we've had a number of discussions with House chairman about this. I think they're favorably moved. Yes, pensions, wage replacement, all that stuff in Germany, making sure poor people can afford energy. Energy poverty is a big, long German word now. But investment in communities, and it just, everything circles back to that investment and what they need, and asking them what they need Reimagine Appalachia and the group that Bill Peduto put together have done fantastic jobs in sort of starting with some bottom up. There was Power Plus, which was inadequately resourced during the Obama years. They had to sort of cobble it together because they couldn't get any money through Congress. But all those things are premised, as Raya was saying, on where are the communities, talk to the communities. So things can be done for coal communities. AML cleanup, we should be doing all that cleanup that we can in as many places. But in the end, it circles back to the coal communities and the EJ communities are polluted and underinvested, and they deserve our attention.
Yeah, there's that similarity, right? It's that you need to talk to the communities from the outset, all throughout, because there's no one size fits all. I mean, there's probably generalities, and investment. Raya, you were about to say something?
Oh, no, I agree with what's been said. Communities and states and folks have ideas. We need revenue generation. Step 2 for the New York Reduce Coalition is a polluter penalty that would levy a price, a penalty, not a carbon trading system, to generate revenue. And the concept being is that we need actual funds to support a just transition, because that includes jobs, but it also could potentially include the tax base of particular communities, how our schools are funded, and we need to have revenue that can support the transition at a community level. And again, it's when I speak to that broad idea of community engagement and how do we fund those tools, because talking to communities and leaders who are under-resourced can be a real burden. And so again, we need to sort of expansively think about how we develop policy in an inclusive way that enables that participation.
So we're going to have 2 last questions that are already in the chat function, and they're both really good questions. And if we go a little bit over, just forgive us. And this is a really good one. Somebody asked, are there any good models or suggestions related to mortgages and physical risk mitigation, work by banks to mitigate harm in vulnerable communities where homes are more vulnerable to physical risks? Raya, would you have any insights into that?
Yeah, I said there's definitely a lot of thinking about residential homes, insurance markets. What do markets for investment and risk look like? In terms of climate resilience. I'll toss it. I'm hard pressed to come up with the model in mind, but it's clearly it's an important issue.
Yeah, Carol, you're muted.
I'm not particularly knowledgeable in this area, except to note that as we sort of redefine areas that will experience flooding, what happens to those homeowners, what happens to that tax base, what happens to those insurance. I mean, frequently it is poor people of color who live in the areas most prone to flooding, and their house may be their biggest investment. It may be their retirement. And so we need to be very mindful of the consequences that come with government making new decisions, or maybe drawing new lines about what is a floodplain, what isn't a floodplain. And I think this just goes back to earlier points that we've all made, which is the intentionality. One of the things I know from being an environmental regulator is I set out to solve problem A, and inevitably there's B, C, D, and E that get created, and I need to be mindful of those. And I may not even notice them until they may not be seeable until I'm well into A. But when they arise, I have to come back and manage them. And that's a really hard thing for government to do, to sort of say, yes, we went this way, but now we realize we have to do this. But when it comes to communities, I think this is absolutely essential. And I apologize, I am going to have to leave this conversation. And I just want to thank you all. It's been
okay.
A conversation.
Oh, sorry. I think my internet is going in and out. I'm sorry about that. Okay, apparently we're back. Okay, so the last question, and that is, somebody asked, how do you cultivate public support for equitable policies, equitable green or climate policies, given the well-funded media disinformation that's focused on pushback. We just saw this in Texas with, the immediate go-to that the Green New Deal was responsible for the blackouts. So, that's about getting buy-in from communities that are affected. That, like you were saying, you're getting stuff, Brad, from Fox News. So how is that? What can be done to address that? And does the Biden administration and federal government play any role?
Well, I would say the piece about public education, public engagement, the work that the government and other groups can do, really vitally important. What we're Zero is trying to do, and the truth is, there's no shortcut to old-fashioned organizing. There's no shortcut, as we saw what happened in Georgia. You have to put your feet in the ground at some point to start moving the needle to organizing. And that's how we got the Climate Leadership and Protection Act in New York. And that's the approach that we need to continue to take, because if we have to keep knocking at the door of getting federal legislation on climate, because the scale of this is too big. We can't make this sea change that we need to at the federal and international level. And we got to keep knocking on the door. And the only way to get the press down is to organize.
Great.
Well, I guess
Go
it
ahead,
was
Brad.
inevitable that it would come to this. My answer is that we're going to have to somehow confront corporate power in the United States, given, Neela, some of your prior reporting, given what the labor movement goes through, right? Just like a better voice for working people. Most people don't know there's a $400 million anti-union industry, annual spending anti-union industry in the United States. That's all about keeping people's voices out of the process and knocking working people down. So at some point, this is the sticks conversation. We're going to have to confront corporate power in this country. It's out of balance, and we can't make the progress we need to make unless we fix that.
You can always be assured of pushback. Well, I want to thank Carol Browner, Raya Salter, and Brad Markell. This has been really great. I've learned a lot, and that's always very useful for me. I'll hand it back now to Dan to make any closing comments. Thanks very much, WRI.
Yeah, just Neela, thanks to you, Raya, Brad, and Carol, as you said, and also thanks to the staff who put this together, to Matt Herbert and Emily Vale at WRI and folks at World War Zero who worked with us. So really appreciate it. Again, thanks all for attending. We will have a recording of this. If any of your colleagues missed it and you want to give them an opportunity to pick up on this conversation. It's a conversation that we want to continue. Obviously, we couldn't get to everything in this time, and critical conversation, but it's great that we're having it and that it has been lifted up and it really is at the center of the conversation now. So really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thanks. This has been great. Thanks very much. Take care. Bye.